The air in the auditorium was so dead quiet I could hear the dry scrape of wool on my dress blues. I sat there spine rigid, a purple heart newly pinned to my chest. Right at that second, my older sister Delia leaned across the aisle. She deliberately threw a look of pure disgust and spoke loud enough for her friends and the surrounding service members to hear. "A purple heart, please. She paid for that ribbon. Desk jockeys, do not bleed." 2 rows back, a sergeant shot to his feet. Then another. In 3 seconds, like a silent tidal wave, the entire Marine Corps formation in the hall stood at attention. The eyes of 300 men and women who had stared down death locked dead onto my sister. From the corner of the room, a gray-haired man with a thick scar across his neck roared through tears. "She brought us home alive." Before I tell you what happened next, take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. But only if this story resonates with you, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is right now. The auditorium turned into a pressure cooker of raw, unadulterated rage. Major General James Cardwell did not flinch. He took long, heavy strides up the wooden steps to the podium. He did not look at Delia. In his world, women like my sister did not exist. They were just background noise. He gripped the edges of the wooden lectern so hard his knuckles yellowed. He leaned in and tapped the microphone. A high-pitched violent squeal of feedback ripped through the speakers. It instantly severed Delia's panicked, breathless whispering. Cardwell held up the declassified command paper. When he spoke, his voice was a low rumble, cold and heavy as a bayonet driving into a hardwood floor. He did not rush the words. He threw each syllable like a cinder block directly at the front row where my blood relatives sat. October 2012, Helmand Province. The room stopped breathing. Lead armored vehicle struck by a command-detonated improvised explosive device. Cardwell's eyes scanned the front row, forcing my family to look at him. Ignoring secondary fires and 2 catastrophic massive hemorrhage wounds to her own body, Captain Olson charged backward into the melting chassis. She refused medical evacuation until the last Marine was secured. I kept my eyes locked front and center, a statue in wool and brass. But the ingrained peripheral vision of an intelligence officer caught every single twitch coming from my father. He was a coastal Oregon logger, a man who spent his entire life measuring human worth with a yellow tape measure and the roar of a chainsaw. To him, you were only worth what you could physically drop on a table, a stack of $100 bills, a newly framed house, a brand new Ford pickup truck. He had spent years convinced I was just a glorified secretary, hiding behind tall concrete walls, pushing paper. Right now, his massive calloused hands permanently stained with cedar sap and motor oil, were digging into the armrests of his velvet chair. His knuckles were dead white. When Cardwell read the words, "massive hemorrhage," my father's broad shoulders completely caved in. His knees actually shook against the fabric of his suit pants. Every arrogant piece of math he had ever done, every snide comment he had used to humiliate me over a dozen Thanksgiving turkeys about how I wasn't doing real work, was being pulverized. It was being ground into dust beneath the polished black Corfam boots of 300 United States Marines. The crowd remained standing stiff and silent. Cardwell stepped away from the podium and walked down the short flight of stairs. The steel heel taps of his dress shoes cracked against the floorboards. Clack, clack, clack. Every step was a hammer blow to my family's eardrums. He stopped squarely in front of me. His massive hand clamped down on my shoulder, the weight of a 2-star general pressing into my collarbone. He leaned his head down, putting his mouth mere inches from my ear. His voice dropped to a rough whisper meant for me and me alone. "Sarah." I ordered a total stand-down that night. Sandstorm blinded the entire grid. I told the network to hold position. He swallowed hard. "You went rogue. You broke my direct orders to go drag my boys out of the fire." Cardwell stepped back. He slowly raised his right hand to the brim of his cover in a razor-sharp textbook salute. "Reading this citation is the greatest honor of my military career," he said, his voice carrying over the silence. Around me, the sound of thick, guttural sobbing broke out. Muscle-bound grunts, men who had seen the worst of humanity, were openly weeping. 2 seats away, Delia shrank into her chair. The golden child was suddenly small, terrified, and utterly mute. When the ceremony finally broke, I did not wait for the handshakes. I did not wait for my father to find his voice or for my sister to conjure up another lie. I bypassed them entirely, pushing my way through the heavy glass double doors and out into the cold, fog-choked base parking lot. I needed to breathe actual air. Staff Sergeant Marisol Vega was already there. She was leaning her back against the cold metal tailgate of my Chevy truck. She was the combat medic who had shoved her bare hands into my torn flesh to clamp down on a spurting artery in the Afghan dirt. I walked up to her. I forced a half smile, opening my mouth to crack a dumb joke to cut the tension. It was my old survival habit. Play it off. Shrink myself down so no one else feels uncomfortable. Vega didn't smile back. Before I could get a single word out, her arm snapped forward. She backhanded the paper coffee cup right out of my hand. It hit the asphalt with a wet smack, dark liquid splattering across the toes of my dress shoes. "I tied off your arm in the pitch-black Sarah," Vega hissed through her teeth. The rage in her voice was thick and suffocating. "I did not rip your life out of the Reaper's hands just so you could sit in that room and let those parasites spit on our blood." I froze. The cold air suddenly felt like it was burning my lungs. Vega closed the distance between us. She jabbed a hard, calloused finger directly into my chest, digging into the fabric just a fraction of an inch below the purple ribbon. "Your sister humiliated you in front of this entire battalion for one reason," Vega said, her voice dropping to a lethal, dead calm register. "Because you fund her miserable existence. You bought her that right." I could not speak. The truth felt like a physical blow to the ribs. Vega pulled her hand back. She looked at me not with pity, but with absolute disgust for my cowardice. "Go home and do the math, Major." Vega's voice stuck to the inside of my skull the whole drive back to the barracks. "Go home and do the math." I reached out and twisted the radio volume knob to 0. The cab of my Chevy truck fell dead silent, leaving only the hum of the tires against the wet asphalt. The smell of the military base, burnt diesel fuel, hot tarmac, and boot polish started to fade from my senses. In its place, a ghost slipped through the AC vents. It was a smell I had spent 20 years trying to scrub out of my pores. Fresh sawdust, sticking, pungent pine pitch. I was born in a logging town wedged deep in the Oregon Coast Range. It was a place where the timber mills were always grinding and the sky was a permanent bruising gray. In our house, under a rusted tin roof that leaked into plastic buckets every November, human value was not an abstract concept. You did not get points for having a moral compass. You did not get points for being smart. My father measured the world with a yellow Stanley tape measure and a chainsaw. He only respected what he could physically put his hands on. A thick stack of 20s slammed onto the kitchen counter on a Friday night. A brand new Ford F250 parked in the mud out front. A straight, solid fence line made of pressure-treated wood. If he could not touch it, bite it, or brag about it over cheap draft beer at the local dive bar, it did not exist. My older sister Delia was engineered to be the exact center of that brutal physical metric. She was 3 years older than me, with bleach blonde hair and a smile she could flip on and off like a faulty light switch. Delia figured out early how to play the local game. She knew exactly how to stroke the egos of rough, exhausted men with a well-timed laugh. She brought home cheap plastic beauty pageant trophies from the county fair. They were worthless pieces of gold-painted junk, but my father would take a damp rag and polish that cheap plastic every single Sunday. He put them right on top of the television so everyone could see his investment paying off. And me, I was a cinder block sitting in the middle of the hallway. I was not soft. I did not flatter anyone. I spent my afternoons hiding in the dark corner of the garage, surrounded by the guts of broken shortwave radios. I stripped wires with my teeth and burned my thumbs on a cheap soldering iron, trying to understand how invisible frequencies traveled through the air. I wanted to know how the world worked. But in my family's eyes, a girl who did not wear makeup, who wore oversized flannel, and who kept her mouth shut was defective merchandise. I had no physical presence. I had no resale value. I learned the exact exchange rate of my father's love when I was 9 years old. It was a rainy Tuesday. I spent 3 hours sitting at the scarred oak dining table. I used stolen scrap paper from the mill and a set of dull-colored pencils to draw a tactical map of the Battle of Gettysburg. I plotted the topography, the troop movements, the flanking maneuvers of Pickett's charge. It was precise. It was brilliant for a kid that age. I sat there kicking my worn-out sneakers under the chair, waiting for the heavy thud of his boots on the front porch. I just wanted him to put his massive rough hand on my head. Just once. The front door groaned open. My father walked in. He tossed his mud-caked hard hat onto the nearest chair, leaving a smear of brown dirt on the upholstery. He did not look at me. He looked straight past my head, watching Delia twirl around in a new denim jacket in the hallway mirror. "Look at that!" He grunted, a rare tone of approval in his voice. I slid the paper across the table toward him. It bumped against his knuckles. He finally looked down. His bloodshot eyes scanned the intricate lines and carefully drawn arrows for a total of 3 seconds. He let out a short, harsh breath. He smelled like stale tobacco and damp wool. "You can't take a daydream to the bank, Sarah," he rasped. "Throw this garbage out. It's cluttering the table." He walked to the fridge. He cracked open a beer. He did not look back. I sat frozen. The blood drained completely out of my face, leaving my cheeks numb and cold. I did not cry. Crying was a weakness that got you mocked in that house. I just stared at the paper. Slowly, deliberately, I folded it in half. The sharp crease broke the union line. I folded it in half again, then again. I pressed down on the edges with my thumbnail until it was a thick, tight square. I shoved it deep into the bottom of my jean pocket. That afternoon, I built a wooden coffin for my own childhood, and I climbed inside. I signed my enlistment papers the morning I turned 18. There was no cake. There was no farewell dinner. At 6 in the morning, I dragged my olive drab duffel bag down the gravel driveway to wait for the Greyhound bus. The coastal fog was thick, chilling the sweat on the back of my neck. My father stood on the wooden porch. He held a mug of black coffee, squinting at me through the steam like I was a hired hand skipping out on a shift. "Playing soldier," he sneered, taking a slow sip. "Don't call here crying for a ride when you wash out." Delia walked out in her pajamas. She gave me a stiff, one-armed hug. Her body was rigid against mine. Her eyes never left the glowing screen of her flip phone. Only my mother moved past the porch steps. She hurried down to the edge of the driveway, keeping the massive steel block of my father's pickup truck between her and the house so he couldn't see. She reached out and grabbed my hand. I felt something rough pressed into my palm. A crumpled $20 bill. She did not say a word. She just looked down at the dirt, terrified of making a scene. She was the silent accomplice funding my exit so she wouldn't have to deal with the friction. I shoved the 20 into my pocket. I grabbed the heavy canvas strap of my duffel and hoisted it onto my shoulder. The air brakes of the Greyhound hissed as it pulled onto the shoulder of the highway. I climbed the metal steps. As the pneumatic doors slammed shut, I looked out the smeared glass window at the house. I was carrying a pathetic, heavy delusion in my chest. I actually believed I was going to put on a uniform, do something great, and use that physical glory to finally buy my father's pride. The United States Marine Corps does not cater to childhood delusions. It chews them up and spits out cold, hard steel. By the year 2008, I wore the brass bars of a second lieutenant. While girls my age back in Oregon were busy posting party pictures on the internet and picking out college graduation dresses, I was learning how to identify the faint metallic odor of C4 explosives buried under desert dirt. I was assigned to route clearance. My daily reality possessed zero Hollywood glory. My life consisted of 16-hour patrols locked inside a stifling armored truck, baking in 120-degree heat. The sweat pooled in my boots. My eyes burned, refusing to blink because a random pile of trash on the side of a dirt road could instantly become a mass grave for the 12 Marines riding behind me. Out there, I learned how to freeze my own fear. I learned how to issue commands in a flat, dead voice that left no room for debate. Out in the sand, I held the power of life and death in my hands. But the second I brought that power home, I voluntarily stripped off my armor. I turned myself back into a ghost. Thanksgiving dinner 2010. It was my first real leave. I sat at the far edge of the oak dining table, keeping a safe distance from the center of attention. Delia had brought Hayden home for the first time. He was a local general contractor with a swelling beer belly and a loud mouth that never stopped running. He spent the first hour bragging about his cheap condo projects and how he aggressively squeezed his drywall subcontractors for pennies. Between bites of sage stuffing, Hayden looked down the table and asked what I did. Delia did not even let me draw a breath. She snatched the conversation right out of the air. She pointed a silver fork dripping with thick brown gravy directly at my face. She rolled her eyes. She files papers for the military or does some sort of filing nonsense. Delia sneered. She is just a desk jockey. I opened my mouth. The blood rushed to my ears. I wanted to drop the reality of a route clearance platoon right onto their porcelain plates. I wanted to tell them about the smell of burning tires and the copper taste of adrenaline. But my father beat me to it. He slammed his heavy glass of draft beer down onto the wood. He let out a rough, hacking laugh. Well, that is good, my father grunted, wiping foam from his upper lip. At least she does not get lost on the way to buy her boss some coffee. The entire table erupted in laughter. Hayden chuckled so hard his face turned red. I closed my mouth. I bit down on the inside of my cheek until I tasted my own blood, and I swallowed the truth. The absolute peak of the humiliation arrived in the summer of 2011 at Delia's wedding. I was a captain by then. I reluctantly wore the stiff, heavy wool of my dress blues to the reception strictly because my mother begged me to do it so the family pictures would look symmetrical. The rented banquet hall was a chaotic, suffocating mess of cheap pop music, spilled champagne, and overwhelming floral perfume. I was standing near the edge of the dance floor when an aunt on Hayden's side of the family approached me. She was smacking a piece of gum between her teeth, her eyes glazed over from cheap wine. Without a word of introduction, she shoved a large, empty stainless steel tray directly into my chest. "Hey, waitress!" she barked, waving a hand toward the kitchen doors. "Go tell the back room to load this up with more shrimp cocktail. Make it quick, we are out." She completely ignored the gleaming gold rank on my shoulders. She ignored the stacked ribbons on my chest. I stood dead still. The cold metal of the tray pressed against the warm wool of my uniform. Every combat instinct trained into my nervous system screamed at me to drop the tray onto the floor, step into her space, and demand immediate respect. But my peripheral vision caught a movement across the room. My father was standing by the bar. He had his massive calloused hand clamped firmly onto Hayden's shoulder. He was pulling the contractor into a tight embrace, yelling the word, "Son," over the deafening noise of the DJ. I looked down at the empty shrimp tray. I turned on my heel. I walked silently across the sticky banquet floor and pushed through the swinging doors into the kitchen. I chose to be a servant rather than detonate a bomb inside my father's perfect day. My cowardice did not buy peace. It simply fed an invisible monster. In the spring of 2012, a dark, heavy intuition settled into my bones. The upcoming deployment into Helmand Province was going to be a bloodbath. I walked into the communications tent at the forward operating base and dialed my parents' house line. The satellite connection was thick with static. The massive diesel generators hummed violently outside the canvas walls. I just wanted to hear a simple blessing. I wanted someone to tell me to come home safe. I gripped the plastic receiver and quietly told my mother that the zone was hot. I told her that improvised explosive devices were buried everywhere in the dirt. Through the receiver, I heard the television blaring in their living room. Then Delia's sharp, irritating voice cut through the background noise. "Tell Sarah to stop being so dramatic," Delia yelled from the couch. "God, she always makes a massive deal out of nothing. What is a bomb going to go off in her filing cabinet?" My mother did not defend me. She breathed a soft, exhausted sigh directly into the phone. "Do not make such a fuss, sweetheart," my mother whispered. A block of solid ice slid down my spine. The hum of the generators outside suddenly sounded like a funeral dirge. I did not argue. I did not say a single word of goodbye. I placed the receiver back onto the cradle and walked out into the blinding desert sun. 12 hours later, I climbed into the lead armored vehicle. 12 hours after my sister told me to stop being dramatic, my up-armored Humvee rolled into the Helmand River Valley. There was no warning, no cinematic click. I did not even hear the explosion. All I felt was a massive crushing change in air pressure that instantly ruptured my left eardrum. The physical force lifted a 14,000-pound war machine clean off the dirt road. The world spun into a violent blur of blinding orange light and screaming metal. When my eyes snapped open, the cab of the Humvee was a slaughterhouse. Flames were already eating through the Kevlar fabric of the back seats. The air was gone. My lungs sucked in a thick, choking mixture of burning rubber pulverized fiberglass and the heavy, sweet stench of roasting meat. Warm liquid ran down my forehead, stinging my eyes. I blinked hard, clearing the blood. The tactical radio panel was a sparking mess of crushed plastic, hissing out dead static. I tried to move my left arm to unbuckle my harness. It did not respond. I looked down. A jagged piece of hot shrapnel the size of a dinner plate was buried deep into my left bicep. My sleeve was soaked, turning black. Through the cracked, spider-webbed ballistic glass of the windshield, the handset of the radio crackled to life. My commander's voice cut through the ringing in my skull. Sandstorm inbound, 0 visibility. Abort all medevac efforts. Entire grid fall back to defensive lines. Hold position. The order was absolute. Fall back, wait out the weather. I turned my head. In the rearview mirror, through the thick black smoke, I saw Private First Class Wyatt Coburn. He was pinned in the back seat. The crumpled roof of the vehicle had collapsed onto his legs. The flames were 2 inches from the hem of his uniform pants. I did not pause to weigh the cost. I did not calculate the risk. I planted my right boot against the heavy steel door. It was jammed shut. I kicked it. Once, twice. On the 3rd strike, the metal latch sheared off and the door kicked open into the blistering heat. The pop, pop, pop of AK-47 fire instantly kicked up the dirt around the tires. Insurgents were firing down from the ridgeline. I ignored them. I threw myself out of the driver's seat and hit the baking sand. I was not a waitress holding a cheap tray of shrimp at a country club wedding. I was a United States Marine Corps captain. Those were my men inside that burning steel trap. I crawled to the rear passenger door. The heat coming off the chassis was unbearable. My eyelashes curled and singed against my skin. I shoved my upper body into the inferno. Coburn was unconscious. His head was slumped forward. Using my only good arm, my right hand, I grabbed the heavy drag handle on the back of his tactical vest. I planted my boots against the melting tire rim. Blood poured from my left arm in thick, heavy spurts, painting the side of the Humvee a slick, shiny red. I let out a guttural roar, using every ounce of strength in my quads and lower back. I ripped Coburn out of the wreckage just as the auxiliary fuel tank ruptured. The shockwave picked us both up and threw us like ragdolls. We tumbled down a steep, dry irrigation ditch. I landed hard on my back, gasping for air. I immediately rolled over, throwing my body weight on top of Coburn to shield him. My left arm was completely useless, hanging limp at my side. With my right hand, I drew my M9 sidearm from my drop holster. I pointed the barrel toward the crest of the ditch, tracking the shadows moving in the dust. I bit down on my bottom lip until I tasted copper. I was not going to let a single Marine die on my watch. The sky turned a suffocating, violent yellow. The sandstorm hit, dropping visibility to 0. A body slid down the dirt embankment and crashed into the ditch next to me. It was Staff Sergeant Marisol Vega, the platoon medic. Her face was coated in a thick layer of dust and sweat. She looked at my arm. The shrapnel wound was pumping bright red arterial blood onto the sand with every single beat of my heart. Vega did not say a word. Her medical bag had burned up in the second vehicle. She had no tourniquets, no gauze, no hemostatic agents. She dropped her rifle into the dirt. She lunged forward, pressing both of her bare, filthy hands directly into my torn flesh. She clamped down on the severed artery with raw brute force. The pressure was so intense, so agonizing that my back arched and I let out a choked gasp. For 3 hours, we lay at the bottom of that ditch while the sandstorm raged above us, grounding every medevac chopper in the province. For 3 hours, Vega did not loosen her grip by a single millimeter. Her knuckles locked. Her forearms cramped and shook, but she did not let go. Her dark eyes stayed locked onto mine, silently ordering me to stay awake. She held my blood inside my body with nothing but her own 2 hands and sheer stubborn willpower. That is what real family looks like. That is the kind of brutal, blood-soaked loyalty my biological relatives would never ever understand. And 14 years later, standing in the cold parking lot of the base in 2026, Vega was right. I had let those parasites spit on that loyalty. I turned away from Vega. I climbed into the cab of my truck and slammed the door shut. I put the truck in drive. I was going back to my quarters. It was time to pull the bank statements. The year was 2026. Staff Sergeant Vega had just ripped the bandage off the ugliest truth of my life. I drove back to the officer quarters in absolute silence. It was past midnight. When I unlocked my door and stepped into the small sterile room, I did not flip the overhead light switch. I walked straight to the edge of the stiff mattress and sat down heavily. I was still wearing my dress blues. The brass buttons dug into my sternum. I stared at my own dark shadow cast against the cheap cinder block wall. For 40 years, I operated under a pathetic, desperate assumption. I truly believed that if I just kept making myself smaller, if I kept quiet, and if I just kept secretly paying their way, my family would eventually carve out a tiny permanent space for me at their table. Vega was right. They did not look at me and see a daughter. They did not see a sister. They saw a low-maintenance ATM machine. I leaned forward and pulled my rugged military-issue Panasonic laptop out of my duty bag. I flipped the heavy screen up and hit the power button. The pale blue light of the monitor washed over the dark room, reflecting in my dry, burning eyes. It was time to pull the balance sheet on my own life. I logged into the secure banking portal. I set the filter parameters, dragging the transaction history all the way back to 2014. The mechanical clicking of my keyboard echoed off the concrete walls. Clack, clack, clack. It was a cold, steady rhythm. Line by line, the bank statements materialized on the screen. Each row of black text sliced into my memory like a razor blade. There were the direct deposits of my hazard pay. That was extra cash the military paid me for the statistical probability of coming home in a body bag. I did not spend a dime of it on myself. I wired it directly into my mother's checking account. I saw the transfer for the emergency hospital bills she cried about. I saw the $3,000 for the rotting roof shingles on the Oregon house. I saw the $800 for a set of brand new heavy-duty Goodyear tires for my father's truck. They took the money without a second thought, and then they immediately scrubbed my fingerprints off the cash. Whenever Delia or the neighbors asked how they afforded the repairs, my parents lied. They called it a small lottery scratcher win, or your father's secret savings stash. They completely erased my existence from those dollar bills. They did it to protect their fragile egos. They could not stomach the humiliation of surviving on the charity of the useless desk jockey they openly mocked at the local dive bar. But the most brutal transaction sat near the bottom of the screen. Winter, 2021. It was a single wire transfer, $18,000. At the time, Hayden's general contracting business was standing on the absolute edge of bankruptcy. The man drank too much, bid too low, and mismanaged his cruise. The bank was threatening to seize his equipment and foreclose on the house he shared with my sister. My mother called me on a secure line. She was sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. She begged me to fix it, but she gave me one strict condition: I had to route the money through a dummy account owned by my aunt. I was absolutely forbidden from letting Hayden or Delia know the cash came from me. His pride will not survive it, Sarah. My mother had pleaded through the static. He will feel emasculated. He will die of shame. Please just do this for the family. I was sleeping on a canvas cot in a freezing bunker at the time. I was eating cheap instant ramen to save money. I had just started looking at floor plans to finally buy a small house of my own. I canceled the house hunt. I took out a high-interest personal loan, bit my tongue, and wired $18,000 to save his miserable company. 3 months later, I flew home for a weekend visit. Hayden stood on a freshly stained wooden deck, a deck my money paid to keep holding a cold beer. He looked me up and down in my civilian clothes, laughed loudly in front of my father, and called me a taxpayer-funded parasite. I sat in the dark barracks room and stared at that $18,000 line item. I moved the cursor to the top of the spreadsheet. I highlighted the entire 12-year column of outgoing transfers. I dragged the mouse down row after row, year after year. I hit the calculate button. The screen blinked. The final sum populated in bold black numbers at the bottom right corner: $119,850. My stomach violently contracted. I leaned over, bracing my elbows on my knees, fighting the sudden urge to vomit. nearly $120,000. A full third of my life's net worth had been shoveled directly into a bottomless pit of sheer ingratitude. For over a decade, I was the load-bearing wall hidden deep inside the framing of that family. I stood in the dark, bearing the crushing weight, keeping the roof from collapsing on their heads. And the people sleeping comfortably inside that house spent every single waking hour swinging a sledgehammer at that exact same wall. I was not noble. I was not a good daughter. I was a coward who had financed my own daily abuse. I looked at the glowing white numbers on the screen. The heavy, suffocating weight of self-pity instantly evaporated from my chest. The desire to be loved by them simply died. In its place, a silent, hyper-focused rage settled into my bloodstream. It was thick and heavy like liquid lead. If you have ever bled yourself dry to save a family that only knows how to look down on you, hit the like button on this video and share your story in the comments section below. Sometimes the exact moment we finally add up the painful numbers is the exact moment we take our lives back. I did not close the laptop. I opened a blank Word document. The flashing cursor waited for my command. It was time to go to war. I opened a blank Word document. The cursor blinked steadily against the stark white background, waiting for a command. I did not write a tear-stained diary entry. I did not type out a long, desperate plea for my family to finally see my worth. The United States Marine Corps taught me a very simple rule about survival: you never negotiate with the people holding you hostage. I formatted the page exactly like a standard military operations order. Arial font, size 12, single-spaced, 1-inch margins on all sides. An OPORD is not designed to soothe hurt feelings. It is a sterile tactical document designed to establish the absolute limits of an engagement zone. I typed the names into the addressees line: Arthur Olson, Diane Olson, Delia Olson, Hayden Cross. My posture was rigid, my breathing was slow and measured. Every single keystroke that echoed off the concrete walls of my barracks room felt like a heavy cinder block being dismantled from the psychological prison they had kept me locked inside for 3 decades. I was not a victim anymore. I was a field-grade officer executing a targeted strike on an enemy supply depot. The core of the letter fit neatly into 3 short, brutal paragraphs. Effective 0001 hours tomorrow, all forms of financial support are permanently terminated. There would be no grace period. There would be no final warnings. I typed out the exact routing and account numbers I'd been secretly funding for the last 12 years. I listed the joint checking account my mother used for house repairs. I listed the dummy account my aunt set up to funnel bailout money to Hayden's failing contracting business. I declared every single pipeline dead. I stared at the screen, my eyes dry and burning from the blue light. I typed the next sentence without blinking. I am done shrinking myself so you people can feel big. I did not ask for the money back. I did not threaten to sue Hayden for the $18,000 he took while calling me a taxpayer-funded parasite. That $120,000 was gone. I wrote it off as a total loss. It was the expensive tuition I had to pay to finally cure my own blindness. Cutting them off financially was not an act of revenge. It was an act of self-preservation. I was simply refusing to buy the bullets for the gun they kept pointing at my head. I moved to the final section of the document. I picked up the thick manila folder Twong Cardwell had handed me after the ceremony. I pulled out the declassified after-action reports and casualty assessments from Helmand Province. I scanned the heavy black text. It detailed the exact chemical composition of the improvised explosive device that launched my Humvee into the air. It listed the exact millimeter depth of the shrapnel wound in my left bicep. It documented the massive arterial bleed, the 3-hour delay in the sandstorm, and the extreme measures Staff Sergeant Vega took to keep me from bleeding to death in a ditch. This was the reality my sister had dismissed as me being dramatic over a filing cabinet. I walked over to the small laser printer sitting on my desk. I fed the reports into the scanner bed and copied every single page. I attached the 30 pages of classified blood and dirt to the back of my 3-paragraph OPUREC. In the conclusion of the letter, I laid out one single non-negotiable condition for engagement. I do not want your apologies. I do not want your delayed pride. But if any of you ever attempt to contact me again, the only acceptable currency is your curiosity. Before you decide who I am, you will read these 30 pages. You will learn the truth. That is the cost of admission to my life. I hit the print command. The plastic machine whirred and clicked. Freshly printed sheets of paper slid into the output tray. I picked them up. The paper was still hot to the touch. The sharp chemical smell of fresh toner hit my nose. It smelled exactly like freedom. I looked at the digital clock on the microwave. 400 hours, 4 in the morning. The base was dead quiet. Outside my window, the sky was pitch black, completely empty of stars. I grabbed my keys, shoved the heavy stack of papers into a thick manila envelope, and walked out the door. The air was freezing. I climbed into the cab of my Chevy truck. The vinyl seat was stiff with the cold. I turned the ignition and the engine roared to life, blowing cold, dusty air through the vents. I put the truck in gear and drove slowly down the empty asphalt roads toward the base post office. There was no traffic. There was no one around to witness the execution. Just the sound of the wind rushing past the windows. I pulled up to the curb. The heavy blue metal of the USPS collection box sat directly under the flickering yellow light of a street lamp. I put the truck in park. I left the engine idling. I stepped out into the freezing air, my boots crunching softly on the loose gravel. I held the thick manila envelope in my right hand. I did not hesitate. I did not allow a single drop of weakness or guilt or fake family loyalty to seep into my brain. I grabbed the cold metal handle of the mailbox chute. I pulled it open. The hinges squeaked in the quiet night. I pushed the heavy envelope over the lip of the steel tray. I let go. I slammed the chute shut. Clang. The heavy metal snapped back into place. The sound was deafening in the empty street. It was a sharp, absolute sound. It sounded exactly like a guillotine blade dropping perfectly onto a wooden block. The truth was out of my hands. The countdown had started. The ruthless, undeniable math of the last 12 years was now in transit, making its way to a wooden porch in Oregon. Exactly 5 days after the heavy steel lid of the post office drop box snapped shut, the bomb went off in Oregon. It was a Wednesday afternoon. I was standing on the live fire range at the base, the sharp crack of M4 rifles echoing off the dirt berms in the distance. The heavy smartphone in my cargo pocket started vibrating violently. I pulled it out. The screen glared in the sunlight. Delia. I stepped back behind the yellow safety line. I reached up and pulled the electronic ear protection off my head. The sudden rush of ambient wind hit my ears. I swiped the green button to accept the call and lifted the phone to my face. I did not say hello. I just stood there breathing evenly, letting the dead air stretch across the cell towers. From the other end of the line, the thick, arrogant tone Delia usually carried was entirely gone. It had been replaced by a high-pitched, frantic wheeze. She sounded like someone who had just missed a step in the dark and was tumbling down a staircase. "What the hell are you doing?" Delia shrieked. Her voice cracked tight with genuine panic. "What is this trash you mailed to the house, Sarah? Are you trying to punish the whole family over that cheap piece of metal they pinned on you?" I stared out at the dirt berms. Her ego was so massive, so completely impenetrable, that she still believed she was the victim. Her bloated sense of superiority was currently burning to the ground, entirely consumed by the blind panic of not understanding why her oxygen supply had suddenly vanished. "There is no punishment happening here, Delia," I replied. My voice was flat, dead, cold as winter frost on a windshield. "For 40 years, you decided my net worth was exactly zero. You stood in front of 300 men and women who have actually bled for this country, and you told them I bought my combat record. I am simply stopping the automatic payments for that level of disrespect." Delia let out a deafening screech through the phone. She demanded to know what damn money I was talking about. She had no idea. The bubble she lived inside was so thick that she never once stopped to ask herself where our mother's hospital deductibles came from. She never wondered how our father afforded a brand new set of heavy-duty truck tires on a retired logger's pension. I did not explain a single syllable of it to her. I pulled the phone away from my ear and tapped the red button. 24 hours later, the second shockwave hit. My phone rang again. This time, it was Hayden. His winter loan payment had hit the deadline, and the secret slush fund from the Phantom Ant had been locked shut. Hayden had seen the bank statements I attached to the OPORD. He had seen the 30 pages of classified combat reports, The loud-mouthed general contractor, the guy who loved to stand on the deck I paid for and call me a taxpayer-funded parasite, was gone. The voice coming through the speaker now was pathetic. He sounded like a stray dog backed into a corner, shivering in the rain. "Sarah, listen to me," Hayden said. I could actually hear the wet, heavy sound of him swallowing hard over the line. "I did not know. I swear to God I had no idea that money was yours." "You did not care whose it was," I said, staring at the concrete floor of my barracks room. "My company is in a massive cash flow bind. Sarah." He babbled, his breathing ragged. "You cannot pull the capital right now. The bank is going to foreclose on the house. They will take the trucks. Delia is losing her mind. Your mother is going to have a heart attack from the stress of this. Please, just for the sake of family." Family. I repeated the word out loud in the empty room. It tasted like ash and copper in my mouth. "You used that word to mock my career for a decade, Hayden," I said, the cold anger finally creeping into the edges of my voice. "You used my blood money to float a failing drywall business, and then you laughed in my face. The math of compound interest does not care how firm your handshake is down at the bar." He started to sob. An actual chest-heaving sob from a grown man. When the begging failed, he immediately pivoted to the ultimate manipulation tactic. He threw his children in front of him like human shields. He promised to pay me back every single penny if I just unlocked the transfers. "I do not want your money, Hayden," I said, cutting off his pathetic wailing. "You can keep the bankruptcy you built with your own two hands." I pulled the phone away from my face. I opened the contact settings. I hit the block caller option. Confirm. I set the phone face down on the desk. There was zero pity in my chest. You do not negotiate with parasites. You just cut off the host. Hayden's fake plastic empire was officially out of oxygen. News travels through a small blue-collar Oregon town faster than a grease fire. Backed into a corner with her husband's trucks about to get repossessed and her secret ATM machine shut down permanently. Delia did what she always did. She went out into the community to dump her toxic waste. She needed allies. She needed the town to validate her narrative. It was a Saturday morning at the local hardware store. The air inside was thick with the smell of fertilizer, cut PVC pipe, and floor wax. Delia stood right in the middle of the main aisle, trapped between the paint mixing counter and the power tools section. She was holding court with three local women who had known our family for decades. She played the perfect wounded victim. "Sarah has completely lost her mind," Delia whined loudly, making sure her voice carried down the aisle. "I just made a tiny joke at her little ribbon ceremony, and now she's trying to bankrupt my family. She made up all these crazy lies about money. You know how those combat people get. They come back completely unhinged." She fully expected the women to nod in agreement. She expected them to pat her arm and validate her completely warped reality, just like they had done for the last 20 years whenever the useless desk jockey sister was brought up. But Delia miscalculated her audience. She did not check her blind spots. Retired Master Sergeant Dotson was standing one aisle over. He was an old-school Marine, a man with a thick white crew cut and a jagged scar running straight down the right side of his neck. He was also one of the 300 Marines who had stood at attention during my award ceremony the week before. He was holding a heavy plastic box of galvanized deck screws. He listened to Delia for exactly 10 seconds. Slam. Dotson slammed the box of screws down onto the metal checkout counter. The sharp, violent crack of heavy plastic hitting aluminum echoed through the entire store. Delia flinched, her mouth snapping shut mid-sentence. Dotson turned around. He did not walk over to her. He stalked. He moved with the slow, deliberate, heavy tread of an old wolf that had just been provoked. He did not care that it was 10 in the morning. He did not care that they were in public. He stopped less than 3 feet from Delia's face. He raised a massive grease-stained hand and pointed a thick finger directly at the bridge of her nose. His eyes were completely black with rage. "Ma'am," Dotson growled. His voice was deep, gravelly, and loud enough to rattle the cans of paint on the metal shelves. "I was in that auditorium. General Cardwell did not read a blood-soaked citation for a damn paper pusher." Delia froze. Her face drained of all color, turning a sickly pale white. Around them, the hardware store went dead silent. 2 local carpenters stopped inspecting lumber. An electrician holding a spool of copper wire froze in his tracks. Everyone turned to watch. Your sister took shrapnel to the arm and ignored it. Dotson roared, stepping 1 inch closer. She crawled into a burning truck under heavy automatic weapons fire to drag one of my boys out of a metal coffin. She bled into the Afghan dirt to keep him alive. And you have the absolute gall to stand here and call her unhinged while you sit at home sucking the cash out of her bank account like a leech. Delia opened her mouth. Her jaw worked up and down, but absolutely no sound came out. She looked at the 3 women she had been gossiping with, silently begging them to intervene. They did not move. You need to learn how to shut your garbage mouth, Dotson said, lowering his voice to a lethal rasp. You need to figure out what the hell the truth actually is before you ever open your face to disrespect an officer of the United States Marine Corps in my town again. Dotson turned his head. He spat a thick wad of saliva directly onto the concrete floor right next to the toe of Delia's expensive leather boot. He picked up his box of screws. He paid the cashier in exact change. He walked out the sliding glass doors into the parking lot without looking back. Absolute suffocating silence dropped over the hardware store. Nobody stepped forward to comfort Delia. The 3 neighborhood women who had just been listening to her sob story slowly took a collective step backward. They looked at Delia, not with pity but with raw disgust. They were looking at a woman who had lied to their faces for decades to cover up her own parasitic existence. Delia dropped her purse. She bent down, fumbled to pick it up, and practically sprinted toward the exit. She kept her head down, her face burning red with a humiliation so profound it seemed to radiate off her skin. By noon, the entire logging town was buzzing. The men who measured the world in physical objects, houses, trucks, and hard cash were rapidly updating their mental ledgers. The perfect golden child mask was completely gone. The fake crown made of plastic beauty pageant trophies had been stomped into the concrete. Delia had been stripped completely naked in the middle of aisle 4, exposing exactly what she really was. The shockwave of truth was moving fast. It had cleared the hardware store. It was already rushing down the highway. It was heading straight for my father's front porch. Late Sunday afternoon, an unfamiliar dark sedan crunched up the gravel driveway of my parents' house. Staff Sergeant Wyatt Coburn stepped out. He was wearing a crisp-ironed, long-sleeve flannel shirt deliberately buttoned all the way down to his wrists to hide the thick, corded burn scars tracking up his forearms. He walked up the wooden steps and knocked on the front door. My father answered. His face was a sickly shade of gray. The humiliating public fallout from Delia's meltdown at the hardware store the day before had already reached his ears. He looked exhausted, like a man who had suddenly aged 10 years in a single weekend. Coburn did not introduce himself with pleasantries. He asked for permission to sit at the scarred oak dining table. My mother nervously poured a glass of ice water, her hands trembling. My father sat down across from the Marine, crossing his thick, calloused arms over his chest. He was bracing for another hit. Coburn did not use sterile, administrative military jargon. He placed both of his hands flat on the rough surface of the wood. And he began to speak. He described the suffocating, oven-like heat inside the armored Humvee. He talked about the smell of burning plastic and human flesh. He described the terrifying high-pitched scream of twisting metal when the chassis caved in. And then, looking directly into my father's bloodshot eyes, he described exactly how their daughter had crawled through a hail of automatic gunfire, her left arm pumping arterial blood into the sand to drag a 200-pound man out of a metal coffin. "I have 2 little kids at home, sir," Coburn said. His voice was rock solid, but his eyes were shining with unshed tears. "I get to watch them grow up because your daughter refused to leave me behind in that fire. She is a god to us." My father sat perfectly still. He was paralyzed. "I drove up here today," Coburn continued, his tone dropping an octave, "because a man has a moral obligation to look another man in the eye and tell him exactly what his daughter did." My father's broad chest heaved. He struggled to pull air into his lungs. The entire metric system he had used to measure human worth his entire life. The brand new trucks, the stacks of cash, the perfectly painted fences was instantly vaporized by the blistering heat of the Helmand Desert. It all meant absolutely nothing. Next to him, my mother buried her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook violently. Suddenly she stood up. She stumbled away from the dining table, her breath hitching in her throat. She practically fell against the old wooden hutch in the hallway. Her shaking hands opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a dented, dust-covered tin box. She walked back to the table and dropped a heavy, thick manila envelope onto the wood. It bore the official seal of the Department of Defense. The postmark was stamped October 2013. It was the official notification and physical awarding of my Purple Heart mailed to my next of kin while I was strapped to a hospital bed recovering from surgery. She had hidden it. For 13 years, that envelope had sat at the bottom of a dark drawer, completely unopened. She had been too much of a coward to look at it. She had been terrified that the bloody reality of my sacrifice would pop the comfortable fake bubble that my father and Delia were living inside. She chose to protect their delusions rather than honor my torn flesh. Right there in front of the Marine I had saved my mother, grabbed the edge of the yellowed envelope. She tore it open. The heavy dark purple ribbon and the gold heart slid out clanking coldly against the oak table. She collapsed into her chair, clutching the cold metal to her chest, and sobbed hysterically. Coburn stood up. He did not offer comfort. He nodded once to my father, turned around, and walked out of the house. The house fell into a deathly, suffocating silence. By midnight, my mother had cried herself into a state of total physical exhaustion and passing out on the living room sofa. My father did not sleep. He picked up the heavy gold medal, the original notification letter from 2013, and the 30 pages of classified combat reports I had mailed them in the Opord. He carried the stack into the kitchen. He turned on the overhead light. The fluorescent tube flickered, casting a sickly yellow glow over the linoleum floor. He sat down at the small kitchen table. He did not drink. He did not turn on the television. He just sat there completely motionless. His thick, rough fingers slowly traced over the bold black text on the pages. Improvised explosive device. Catastrophic fire. Massive hemorrhage. He stared down at the wreckage of his own life's work. He had spent 40 years building a rigid, unforgiving system of value, and he had used it to systematically crush the only child who actually possessed his rugged, unyielding endurance. He had spent a lifetime polishing cheap plastic trophies while bearing solid gold in the dark. He sat at that table, his hands resting flat on the wood, trapped inside a prison of his own making. Outside the kitchen window, the pitch-black sky slowly started to bleed into a cold, heavy gray dawn. Early the next morning, my father got into his battered Ford pickup. He turned the key, put it in drive, and drove 7 straight hours from the Oregon coast directly to the front gate of my military base. It was something he had never done. In the 2 decades since I stood shivering at the Greyhound bus stop at 18, he had never once made the trip to see where I lived or what I did. I walked out of the administration building at 0800. The morning fog was still heavy, clinging to the asphalt of the parking lot. I saw him standing next to the rusty front quarter panel of his truck. He looked terrible. His broad, usually rigid shoulders were slumped forward. He looked hollowed out, older than his years, stripped of the aggressive pride that had defined his entire life. He was holding a stained, oil-smudged baseball cap in his hands, aggressively twisting the fabric between his thick fingers. A man who had spent 40 years fortifying a concrete bunker of stubbornness was currently ripping it down with his bare hands. I stopped a few feet away from him. I kept my posture straight. I did not cross my arms. I just waited. He did not look up immediately. He stared hard at the toes of his work boots. I watched his throat work as he took a massive, shuddering breath. He looked like he was swallowing broken glass. When he finally spoke, he used the only rough, unpolished language he knew. "I measured you by what I could see in front of my face." My father rasped, his voice cracking hard. "My whole life, I measured you exactly the same way I measure a piece of rough-cut lumber in the shop. If I could not put a tape on it, I decided it had no value." He lifted his head. His eyes were bloodshot, the rims bright red and heavy with water. "The greatest piece of work you ever built. The blood you actually left in the dirt. I could not see it. So I just decided it did not exist. I never once tried to look any harder." He wiped a heavy hand across his mouth. "I am sorry, Sarah, not just for sitting quietly at that ceremony. I am sorry because for 40 years I chose to be a blind coward." He did not offer an excuse. He did not blame my mother's silence. He did not blame Delia's manipulations. He stood in the freezing fog and owned every single ounce of his failure. Hearing that naked, unshielded apology hit me with a violent physical reaction. It hurt. It felt exactly like the agonizing burning sensation of fresh blood rushing back into a limb that had been tied off by a tourniquet for way too long. The numbness broke. 3 months later, in late June, I drove back to Oregon for a weekend dinner. The house felt entirely different. The suffocating manufactured tension was gone. Delia was not there. Following the collapse of Hayden's contracting business, the bank had foreclosed on their house. They had packed up a rented U-Haul and moved out of state to live in a cramped apartment near Hayden's brother. The golden child's reign was officially terminated. I walked through the front door and stepped into the living room. I stopped dead in my tracks. Hanging directly in the center of the main wall was a heavy custom-built wooden frame. My father had sourced a piece of premium flawless white oak from the mill. He had sanded it down by hand until the grain was perfectly smooth and finished it with a dark, rich stain. Pressed securely behind the glass was the declassified Hellman citation. Positioned perfectly in the center, mounted on a piece of dark velvet, was the Purple Heart. He had not hidden it in a hallway drawer. He had driven a heavy steel nail right into the main stud of his living room wall. He hung the frame right next to a vintage worn-out crosscut saw and a rusted logging hook, the absolute most sacred symbols of the Olsen family's working-class heritage. My invisible sacrifices had finally been dragged out of the dark. They were being honored under the exact same light as the physical back-breaking labor that defined my father's entire existence. I heard a floorboard creak. I turned my head. My father was standing in the doorway of the kitchen. He did not say a word. He held a dish towel in his hands, just watching me look at the wall. A very faint, quiet smile touched the corners of my mouth. We sat down for dinner. The clinking of silverware against the plates felt normal. The air in the room was finally breathable. Later that evening, while my parents were washing dishes, I stood alone in the living room. I looked up at the heavy gold medal locked behind the glass. As I stared at it, a strange, creeping realization washed over the back of my neck. I had spent half of my life bleeding in foreign deserts. I had built an entire career wrapped in Kevlar and steel, silently screaming for this exact moment. I wanted their physical nod of approval more than I wanted oxygen. But standing there in the quiet house, staring at the physical proof of my worth, I realized the most profound truth of my entire life. I did not need it anymore. The heavy wool of my uniform was enough. The jagged, ugly scars tracking across my left bicep were enough. The brutal, unyielding loyalty of people like Staff Sergeant Vega and Private Coburn was enough. I was already whole. My ultimate freedom did not arrive the second my father hung that wooden frame on the wall. My freedom arrived the exact second I realized I could walk out the front door, get in my truck, and live a massive, fulfilling life, whether that frame was hanging there or not. I had completely detached myself from the desperate hunger for their validation. I stepped back from the wall. I turned the living room lamp off, casting the Purple Heart back into the shadows. I walked out of the house and into the cool Oregon night. I had finally walked off the battlefield, and I was the quietest victor in the world. Sometimes the greatest victory is not forcing people to recognize your worth, but realizing you are already entirely complete